When Claire opened the dusty attic trunk, she expected old clothes, maybe forgotten books. Instead, she found a photograph album, cracked leather, no name, no date, yet every face inside looked like her family. Except one, a boy, smiling at the camera, standing between her grandparents, labeled in neat handwriting, "Our son, Peter." But Claire had never heard of a Peter. Her mother was an only child, or so she'd been told. Would you open an album that shows a life your family swore never existed? Subscribe to Years Ago Stories, because some memories don't fade. They wait to be found. The attic was colder than Claire remembered. Dust floated through the narrow beam of light cutting in from a cracked window, drifting like lazy snowflakes through the air. Every step she took stirred a faint smell of cedar and thyme. She hadn't been up here since her grandmother passed. The old house had been locked for months, the kind of place that carried silence like a second skin. Her mother couldn't bear to sort through it yet, so she'd asked Claire, the practical one, to start clearing things away. Claire knelt by an old chest near the eaves. The wood groaned softly as she lifted the lid, revealing the past folded linens, yellowed postcards, and brittle letters tied with string. It was all expected, all ordinary, until she saw it. A photograph album, thick and heavy, wrapped in faded floral fabric. Its edges were frayed, but the clasp was still intact, as if guarding something not meant to be touched. She hesitated. Then curiosity won. The cover creaked as she opened it, and the first page fluttered softly, revealing black and white photographs of her grandmother in her youth, hair pinned back neatly, smiling in front of the house Claire now stood in. Her grandfather beside her, younger, leaner, holding a small child, her mother as a baby. Claire smiled, touched by the familiarity of it. Each page turned like a gentle heartbeat of memory. Summer picnics, winter holidays, birthdays captured in perfect squares of fading film. But halfway through the album, the rhythm broke. The pages began to feel different. The handwriting in the margins shifted from her grandmother's neat loops to something rougher, hurried. The lighting in the photos changed too. These weren't celebrations. These looked like documentation. A hospital room, a crib with no nameplate, a young woman sitting beside a bed, her face turned away from the camera. And then, a child, 5, maybe 6 years old, standing between her grandparents. The smile was wide, almost identical to her mother's, but something about it made Claire's stomach twist. Below the picture, written in her grandmother's hand, "Our son, Peter, 1958. Claire froze. She whispered the name aloud as if testing it. Peter? Her family didn't have a Peter. Her mother had always said she was an only child. She'd told that story so many times it had become truth. Her hands shook as she turned another page, but there were no more photographs. Instead, tucked between the last pages was a folded piece of paper, edges brittle and yellowed. The ink had bled in places, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her grandmother's. To whoever finds this, perhaps one day, when the truth can do more good than harm. Claire stopped reading. Her heart pounded so loud she could hear it echoing through the rafters. She looked toward the attic door, half expecting someone to be standing there, her mother, maybe, ready to explain everything. But she was alone. She forced herself to read on. "We had a son before your mother was born. His name was Peter. He was the light of our lives, and the ache of it too. When he fell ill, we were told there was nothing we could do. But then, one night, he was gone, not gone as in lost, but gone as in taken. We searched, we begged, but no one ever spoke of him again." The words blurred. Claire set the letter down and pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "Taken?" She whispered the word aloud, and the attic seemed to listen. For a moment, she couldn't move. The photographs, the letter, all of it felt too heavy to belong to the real world. Then she took out her phone and snapped a quick picture of the page, just to remind herself later that it wasn't a dream. When she climbed back down the ladder, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the kitchen windows, touching the dust on her sweater like glitter. She set the album on the table, staring at it as if it might speak. Her mother would be arriving in an hour, and Claire didn't know what scared her more, that her mother had kept this secret all her life, or that she truly didn't know it existed. When the front door creaked open, her mother's voice followed. "Claire, are you still here, sweetheart?" Claire hesitated. Her throat was dry. "In the kitchen, Mom." Her mother, Helen, appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her old gray coat, the one that always smelled faintly of lavender and rain. She smiled, tired but warm. "You've been up there all day. Did you find anything interesting?" Claire swallowed. "You could say that." Helen crossed to the counter, setting down her purse. When her gaze finally landed on the album, the color drained from her face. Her hand froze mid-motion, and for a moment she simply stared at it, as though she were seeing a ghost. "Where did you find that?" "In the attic," Claire said carefully. "Inside Grandma's old chest." Helen didn't move closer. "You opened it?" Claire nodded slowly. "There's a boy in the photos. His name is Peter." The silence that followed was heavier than the dust upstairs. Helen's shoulders sagged, and her eyes glistened. "You weren't supposed to find that," she whispered. Helen sank into a chair, her hand trembling as she reached for the album. "I thought I destroyed it years ago." "Why would you do that?" "Because it hurt too much to keep," she said, voice breaking. "And because it wasn't my story to tell." She brushed the cover lightly with her fingertips, as though afraid it might burn her. "Your grandparents had Peter when they were barely older than you. He was everything to them. Then he got sick, scarlet fever, the doctor said. He recovered, or so they thought, but there were complications. And then a disappearance." Claire frowned. "Disappearance?" Helen nodded. "He was taken to a children's hospital in another town for tests. Days later, they said he'd been transferred, but there were no records. No one could tell my parents where he'd gone." Claire felt the world tilt. "Are you saying he was stolen?" Her mother closed her eyes. "That's what my father believed until the day he died. My mother refused to speak of it again. She said silence was safer, that the past could destroy what little we had left." Helen turned the pages slowly, stopping at the picture of the little boy between her parents. "I barely remember him," she said. "I was 3 when he vanished. I just remember holding his hand in the garden one morning, and by nightfall, he was gone. After that, every Christmas, Mom would light a candle at the table. She said it was for the missing light." Claire stared at the photograph. The boy's grin looked alive, defiant. "You never tried to find him?" "I did," Helen said quietly. "When I was in college, I searched hospital archives, adoption records, even newspaper clippings. Nothing. It was as if he'd been erased. Eventually, I told myself he must have died. It was easier than imagining something worse." The clock ticked steadily. The house felt suddenly too large, too full of echoes. Claire could almost hear her grandmother's voice. "We had a son before your mother was born. He was taken." "What if he didn't die?" Claire said. Helen's eyes lifted, startled. "What are you saying?" Claire leaned forward, her voice low. "What if he was adopted out under a different name? Hospitals did that sometimes back then, especially if the parents couldn't pay the bills or the case got misfiled." Her mother shook her head slowly, almost fearfully. "You've been watching too many mystery shows." "Maybe," Claire admitted. "But Grandma left that letter. She wanted someone to find it. What if she believed he was still alive?" Helen looked at her for a long time, the old grief flickering behind her eyes like a candle fighting the wind. "And what would you do, Claire, if you found him? He'd be 70 now, a stranger." "Maybe," Claire said softly. "But he'd still be family." They sat in silence for a long while. The kettle whistled softly in the background, a reminder of life's small insistences. Finally, Helen exhaled, shoulders shaking. "If you really want to know," she said, "there's a box in the hall. Closet. Letters. Bills. Old hospital receipts. I kept them all. I told myself I couldn't throw them away, that maybe one day I'd look again. Maybe today is that day. Claire nodded, her pulse quickening. Then we'll look together. As her mother rose to fetch the box, the last light of day pooled around the album, glinting off the words, "Our son, Peter." For the first time, the photograph didn't look ghostly. It looked like a promise. The box in the hall closet was heavier than Claire expected. Dust lined its edges, and when Helen lifted the lid, the faint scent of mothballs and old paper filled the air, that unmistakable smell of things the world had forgotten. Inside were folders, yellowed envelopes, and a stack of receipts bound with a cracked rubber band. Hospital bills from the late 1952, notes scribbled in pencil, a few brittle Polaroids that had turned nearly sepia with age. Helen sat on the couch and began sorting through them, her hands trembling slightly. Claire knelt beside her, glancing over each paper as it was lifted. "Here," Helen said softly, holding out a torn medical form. This was the last hospital he was in. Street Alora Children's Ward, dated March 1959. Claire took it gently, her eyes scanning the faded type. "It says he was transferred, but the section for the receiving facility is blank." "That's how it always was," Helen whispered. Every paper just led to another question. Claire frowned. "And this stamp, Case 117B, that looks like a reference number. If it's a code, maybe the National Archives could trace it." Her mother gave a tired smile. "You sound like your grandfather. He wrote to every office he could. Most of them never replied." Claire's phone buzzed softly, a notification from a genealogy app she had used once before, years ago. The thought flickered through her mind like a light turning on in the dark. "Mom," she said slowly, "if Peter was alive, he might have descendants. We could run a DNA search. It's not impossible." Helen looked startled. "You mean one of those tests people use to find long-lost relatives?" Claire nodded. "They're more advanced now. It's worth trying." Helen hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But first, let's see if there's something else in here." At the very bottom of the box, beneath a stack of folded letters, Claire found a small envelope sealed with red wax brittle, almost crumbling. On the front, in her grandmother's looping script, were 3 words, "In case you wonder." Her pulse quickened. She broke the wax gently and pulled out a single photograph. It was of her grandmother, standing on a porch with a young man, not a boy this time, but a teenager, maybe 17. He had the same grin as the child in the album. Behind them was a sign that read, "Street Barrow Home for Boys." "Mom," Claire whispered. "Look at this." Helen took the photo, her breath catching. "That can't be. It says 1969 on the back," Claire said, turning it over. 10 years after he disappeared. Helen's hand flew to her mouth. Then he survived. She found him. They spent the rest of the night combing through records online, old hospital closures, orphanage relocations, charity organizations. Each lead seemed to vanish just as quickly as it appeared. Finally, close to midnight, Claire leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. There's nothing left of the Street Barrow home. It shut down in the 1980 seconds. The land was sold. Helen sighed, staring at the old photo. Maybe this is where the trail ends. But Claire wasn't ready to let it end. She enlarged the photo on her phone and noticed something she hadn't before. A small number stenciled on the porch railing. Hasson 427. "That could be the street number," she murmured. She ran a quick search and gasped. "Mom, it's still there. The building's still standing." Helen blinked. "Where?" "Just 2 towns over. It's a community center now." The next morning, the sky was pale and heavy with fog as they drove out of town. The road curved past fields rimmed with frost, and the trees leaned like silent witnesses. When they arrived, the building stood tall and solemn red brick, ivy crawling up the sides, windows half fogged by the cold. A weathered plaque near the door read, Street Barrow Community Center, established 1948. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and old wood. A volunteer greeted them kindly. My grandmother used to work here, Claire said carefully. We're looking for records from when it was an orphanage Street Barrow home for boys. The woman's brow furrowed. Most of those records were transferred to the county archives decades ago, but, she paused, glancing toward a locked cabinet. There are a few ledgers that never left. Come with me. The volunteer unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a massive leather-bound book. Dust rose as it opened. Pages filled with names and dates written in careful ink. Helen's eyes scanned desperately, finger tracing line after line. There, look, Claire. Peter Whitmore. Claire leaned over. The entry was brief. Admitted February 1959. Released March 1969. Adopted, record sealed. Helen's knees gave out, and she gripped the edge of the table. He lived 10 years, and someone adopted him. Claire touched her mother's arm. Then he might still be out there. Helen's tears fell silently onto the page. After all this time, my brother's still somewhere in the world. The drive back home was quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the car and the steady rhythm of Helen's breathing as she stared out the window. She hadn't said much since they left the community center. Her eyes, distant and reflective, seemed to be focused on the landscape of her memory rather than the road ahead. When they arrived, the house felt different, fuller somehow, as if the truth they had unearthed had taken shape and was now sitting quietly among them. Claire set the box of documents on the kitchen table and began making tea. She needed something ordinary to ground herself again. Helen stayed standing by the window, arms crossed. I keep thinking about that ledger, she said finally. It said he was released in 1969. He was a teenager, old enough to remember us. Claire poured the tea carefully. Maybe he tried to find you. Helen shook her head. If he did, he never found a way. Or maybe he thought we didn't want him anymore. Claire turned toward her, her voice gentle. Then maybe we owe him the truth now. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, the soft blue light of her laptop flickering across her face. She had uploaded her DNA profile to the genealogy site 2 days earlier. She refreshed the page for the 5th time that hour, not really expecting anything. And then, a new notification. Possible relative match. 43% shared DNA. Likely first cousin. Her breath caught. She clicked the profile. The name read, Michael Porter, age 46, Ohio. She stared at the screen. Porter. It wasn't much, but it was something. She scrolled through his family tree and stopped cold when she saw a familiar name listed under Mother. Adopted from Street Barrow Home for Boys, 1969, Claire whispered. Oh my God. She didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, she showed the profile to Helen, whose hands trembled as she held the phone. It could be him, Claire said softly. Michael Porter could be Peter's son. Helen blinked hard, her lips parting as if to speak but finding no words. We have to be sure. Claire nodded. I'll message him. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed, Hello, Michael. I believe we might be related. I recently discovered records from Street Barrow Home for Boys. Does that name mean anything to you? She hit send and stared at the screen. The typing bubble appeared almost instantly. It does. My father grew up there. He passed away 5 years ago. Why do you ask? Claire's heart pounded. She typed again, fingers trembling. Because I think your father might have been my mother's brother. His birth name was Peter Whitmore. There was a long pause. Then came the reply. My dad's adoption papers only said Peter W. He never knew his last name. He used to say he had flashes of a house with an oak tree and a woman singing by the window, but he thought it was just a dream. Helen covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "That's my mother," she whispered. Claire read the next message aloud. "If this is true, then I guess I've just found the family my dad spent his whole life looking for." A week later, they met in a quiet park halfway between their towns. Michael was tall, soft-spoken, and carried a photograph in his wallet, his father at 20, smiling faintly in a faded Polaroid. Helen reached for it with trembling hands. "That's him," she breathed. "That's Peter." Michael nodded. He always wondered if someone was still waiting for him. Every Christmas, he'd set an extra chair at the table. Helen broke into a sob, the kind that carried decades of silence inside it. Claire wrapped her arms around her mother, and for a long time, none of them spoke. When Helen finally looked up, she managed a shaky smile. "He never really left, did he?" Michael shook his head. "No, he carried you with him." Before they parted, Michael handed her a small photo from his father's things, the same one of their grandmother and the teenage boy outside Street Barrow. "He kept this his whole life," he said. "He didn't know who she was, now I do." Helen smiled through tears. "Then this photo belongs here again." She took it home and placed it inside the old album, right next to the picture of the little boy between her parents. The circle was finally whole. The photograph album sat open on the dining table once more. But this time it didn't feel like an artifact of grief. It felt alive. The pages no longer whispered of loss. They hummed quietly with completion. Every photograph, every name, every crease in the paper, now connected to someone known, remembered, and loved again. Helen sat beside the album, running her fingers across the cover. "It's strange," she said softly. "All these years, I thought forgetting was the same as healing. But maybe we only heal when we remember." Claire smiled gently. "Grandma must have known that. That's why she hid the album but didn't destroy it. She wanted someone to find the truth when it was finally safe to know." Helen nodded. "And she was right. I think she knew you'd be the one to find it." When everyone had settled, Helen stood. "There's someone I want you all to meet," she said, her voice trembling but strong. She gestured to the screen of the laptop on the table, where Michael appeared on a video call, smiling shyly. "This is Michael Porter," she said. "He's my brother Peter's son, your cousin, your uncle's child, our family." The room went still. Then came the sound of someone clapping softly, followed by another. Soon, the room filled with applause, not the loud kind, but the kind that comes from hearts breaking open and mending at the same time. Michael laughed quietly. "My father would have loved this," he said through the speaker. "He always wanted a big family reunion." Helen pressed a hand to her heart. "He has it now." After the call ended, Claire lingered by the album. "Mom," she said, "we should add one more page for what comes next." Helen smiled. "I was thinking the same thing." Together, they slipped a blank sheet into the back of the album and began to write a new letter. "To whoever finds this in the years to come, this album once held secrets, but now it holds truth. It is proof that time can separate, but love always finds its way back. If you are reading this, remember, every photograph tells two stories, the one that was lived and the one that waited to be found." They signed their names beneath it, Helen and Claire Whitmore. 2025. Helen closed the album gently. "This time," she said, "we're not hiding it. We'll keep it where everyone can see." That evening, Claire hung the photo of Peter and their grandmother in the hallway, right between the wedding picture of her parents and a candid shot of her own childhood. She stepped back, smiling. Her mother joined her, coffee in hand. "It looks right there," Helen said softly. Claire nodded. "It belongs with the rest of us." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the faint creaks of the house, the old floorboards settling, the clock ticking steadily in the background. The same sounds that had filled this house for generations, still carrying the rhythm of family life. For the first time, the house didn't feel haunted by secrets. It felt held as though the walls themselves were breathing a sigh of relief. Later that night, Claire sat by the window, watching snow begin to fall outside. The reflection of the hallway photo gleamed faintly in the glass, her grandmother, young again, standing beside the brother they'd all thought was lost forever. Claire smiled. "Welcome home," she whispered. The kettle clicked softly in the kitchen, and somewhere upstairs, her mother hummed an old lullaby, one her grandmother used to sing, one Peter might have heard once before sleep. The melody wrapped around the house like a promise kept. And perhaps, somewhere, someone else has an attic, a box, or an album that holds a missing piece of their own story, something left behind not to hide the truth, but to protect it until the right hands opened it. Years passed, as quietly as dust settling on old pages. The house changed owners, the seasons kept turning, and the world moved forward faster, louder, more digital. Yet, in Helen's living room, the photograph album remained exactly where it had always been, on the table beneath the window, catching the same slant of morning light that once fell on her mother's sewing machine. It had become something more than a family heirloom. It was now a living archive, an object that drew people in, each visitor asking the same question: whose faces are these? Helen would smile and say, "Ours." But not all of them were found easily. Then she would open the first page, smoothing the fragile corners with care, and begin the story not as tragedy, but as triumph. One winter afternoon, a group of children from the local school visited as part of a history project. Their teacher, a gentle woman named Mrs. Allen, asked Helen if they could see the famous album. Word of it had spread in town how a single attic discovery had reunited generations. Helen welcomed them with cocoa and let them gather around the table. The children leaned in, their faces bright with curiosity. "Why are the pictures all in black and white?" one asked. "Because color hadn't been invented yet," Helen said with a soft laugh. But feelings were. She told them about Peter, the boy who vanished, the family who searched, and the letter that waited half a century to be read. And when she finished, there was a hush, the kind that comes when young hearts meet the weight of truth for the first time. A girl with braids raised her hand. "So, he's really gone?" Helen nodded gently. "Yes, but not the way you think. He's part of us now, just in a different way." The children smiled, as if that answer was enough. When Helen grew older and the house grew too big for her, Claire brought the album to her own home. She didn't hide it in an attic. She placed it in a glass case by the hallway, beside the framed photo of Peter and their grandmother, the two of them forever frozen in light. Each year, Claire's children would take it down during the holidays and leaf through its pages. They knew the story by heart, yet somehow it never grew old. It wasn't just about a lost brother anymore. It had become a lesson passed down through time. That love doesn't fade. It only waits for someone brave enough to look back. On the inside of the back cover, Claire wrote a few simple words in her own hand. "The past is not behind us, it walks beside us, quietly teaching." On a gray November morning, decades after the discovery, Claire received a letter postmarked from a small museum 2 towns away. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore, we're curating an exhibit titled Letters That Found Their Way Home. Your family's story has inspired many, and we would be honored to include a digital replica of the Whitmore album. Please know, it will be displayed not as an artifact of loss, but as a testament to hope." Claire smiled through tears as she read it aloud to her daughter, Anna. "Looks like the story gets to keep traveling," she said. Anna grinned. "Then we'll visit it every year, like it's part of the family." Months later, the exhibit opened to the public. The room was softly lit, with shelves of letters and photographs suspended under glass. In the center stood a small wooden table not unlike Helen's, and upon it, the replica of the album, open to the page labeled, "Our son, Peter, 1958. Visitors approached quietly, almost reverently. Some smiled, some cried. Others simply stared, lost in their own reflections. A small plaque beside it read, "The Whitmore Album, discovered in 2025. A family's hidden story revealed through love, persistence, and one forgotten photograph. Sometimes, the truth doesn't disappear, it just waits to be seen again. Years later still, when Claire's granddaughter Emily inherited the house, she found the original album exactly where her grandmother had left it. She was 17, curious, and full of questions. As she turned the pages, she whispered, "You're all here, aren't you?" And though the room was silent, she swore she heard the faintest creak, as if someone had just taken a seat beside her, ready to hear the story told one more time. She smiled and began reading aloud. In the end, the album became more than proof of a past rediscovered. It became a tradition of remembering, of facing what was lost without fear, and of teaching each generation that stories, once found, must be shared to stay alive. The faces inside never aged, the smiles never faded. Each one, a small echo of the same truth Peter had once embodied, that even when life separates us, memory brings us back together. And so the album lived on, not in secrecy, not in sorrow, but in the open, where sunlight and laughter could reach it. Because stories, like families, survive only when someone keeps turning the pages. If you've ever discovered something unexpected from your family's past, a photo, a letter, a name, share it in the comments below. Every hidden story deserves to be remembered. Subscribe to Years Ago Stories, where forgotten memories find their voice again. Sometimes, the most powerful discoveries aren't the ones that change history, they're the ones that remind us who we are. And sometimes, all it takes to bring the past home again is opening a single album that shouldn't exist